What did Jesus mean when he said, "It is finished"? John's gospel stands out in the unique way it depicts these last words of Christ from the cross. Matthew's gospel depicts the cry of dereliction in Matthew 27, verse 46. And a little bit later in verse 50, he states, "When Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit." Mark also includes the cry of dereliction and simply adds, "With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last," in Mark 15:37. Luke seems to approach the last words of Christ as a combination of these two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. So the Gospel of John stands out since it does not include any form of cry or loud voice in these final moments on the cross. Instead, it describes Jesus as simply saying, "It is finished." And this beckons the question, what was finished? In my New Testament class at seminary, we've been discussing the atonement, which, to put it simply, is payment for an offense that allows for reconciliation. And my professor has been raising a good point that the atonement was not simply the moment of Jesus' death on the cross, but must also include other aspects of his work in his life following and approaching Golgotha. The most clear example of this is seen in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, urging them not to forsake the resurrection of Christ, since without it, our faith would be for nothing. Certainly, Jesus' death was not the only thing that accomplished our reconciliation with God. Without resurrecting from the dead, his death would have just been no different from any other sage or prophet or, quote, Messiah from the same time. And on the topic of resurrection, Muslims certainly disagree with Christianity on that. And from their perspective, they would affirm Jesus' prophetic status and even the degree in which he died, but they would utterly deny his resurrecting from the dead. And in my perspective, denial of the resurrection is, by definition, a rejection of what Christianity professes, since bodily resurrection is our hope. If Jesus did not raise from the dead, then Christianity cannot be true. And the same goes for Jesus' ascension, his intercession for us, and the promise of his return in glory. And for more on those, see Matthew 28:16 through 20, Luke 24:50 through 53, and Acts 1:1 through 11. So what exactly then does the cross finish? If atonement is dependent on these other aspects of Jesus' work post-crucifixion, then the death on the cross finishes some aspects of atonement, but certainly not atonement as a whole, right? I hope to shed some light on this conversation with the caveat that I am not a professional biblical scholar. So everything I should say here would be taken with a grain of salt. I will say, though, that in more recent reflections on the doctrine of incarnation, on what it means to be human, and other thoughts on redemption and suffering have helped shed some light and insight into what I'm about to share with you today. And I think these last words of Jesus beautifully portray the great depths of emotion and feeling he took on in his incarnation, and should give us hope for what it means to live as followers of Christ while still remaining in this sinful world in our corrupted flesh. John makes it very clear from the onset that Jesus' coming into this world is theologically significant. The doctrine of incarnation is clearly being portrayed in the earliest verses of John's account. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Incarnation is the Word becoming flesh. It's all about God coming to dwell with us. And this is such a beautiful doctrine, and we unfortunately do not have time to linger on it too long. But it's important as we try to understand the nature of Jesus' humanity and what that actually looked like. We must be reminded that Jesus walked this very earth. He rose with the sun. He grew tired and weary from his work and had to find a place to lay down his head every once in a while. When Jesus changes the water into wine at the wedding in Cana, his response to his mother's request also sheds light to his humanity. "Why do you involve me? My time has not yet come." Jesus is clearly aware of some sort of timeline. This implies that he knows a time is to come, and that it in fact is not here yet. You can sense a certain degree of frustration in his voice here when he's enjoying the fellowship and celebration that you would commonly experience at a wedding, and he's being pulled away for something that's not quite yet ready to unfold. And when speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus clearly is aware of her sin, yet he has compassion on her, offering her water that will not leave her thirsting ever again. Because of this, Jesus stayed in that community for 2 more days, and many more became believers. Jesus is aware of this woman's condition, and yet he still chooses to fellowship with her and within her community. He's able to empathize with them, and as a result of this testimony of his staying with them, the fellowship of believers begins to grow. A man invalid of 38 years would wait at the pool for healing, and he himself tells Jesus that no one would help him. And this is contrasted when Jesus does in fact help him, but not in the way that the man initially expected. He tells him instead, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And when the disciples are in the dark, tossed to and fro by the wind out in the middle of the lake, Jesus approaches them and comforting them with these words, "It is I, do not be afraid." And in John 7, Jesus again affirms that the right time has not yet come, but he reflects on the emotion and the pain of being hated by the world when he tells his disciples, "The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that what it does is evil." And Jesus shows empathy for the woman caught in adultery. New Testament scholar Craig Keener actually points out that the absence of the man is particularly concerning, who would have also been likely brought to trial in this way. But since he is not there, this is maybe why Jesus has compassion for her. So when he intervenes on her trial and what would be her execution, by the end of it all, he turns to her and asks, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So not only does Jesus show his humanity in the defense of this woman here, but also when he tells her to leave the life of sin, to go and do it no more. He says, avoid the future and the eternal death that is to come from this lifestyle and walk in the ways of God's design instead. Jesus speaks of intimacy found in a relationship with him and knowing him. He compares himself to a shepherd and us, his sheep, who will know his voice in John chapter 10. And famously, after the death of his friend Lazarus, Jesus saw the suffering of his friends in the community around Lazarus over the loss. And John tells us that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And a bit while later, after being taken to the place where Lazarus had been laid, Jesus wept. When finally speaking of that time that was now approaching, where he would have to fall to the ground and die like a kernel of wheat, Jesus expresses his pain. "Now my heart is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." The emotions only build up from here as Jesus washes his disciples' feet in chapter 13, making them deeply ponder, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" And he calls himself a servant. And even as Judas approaches for the moment that he would betray him, Jesus does not scold him or try to prevent him from doing what must be done. He simply tells him, "What you are about to do, do it quickly." And my point in sharing all these examples is that they clearly reveal Jesus' varying emotions over the course of the Gospel of John. Jesus knew what it meant to walk this earth, experiencing the emotions of human life, just like you and I. He knew joy and laughter from the celebration of a wedding. He saw outcasts of the culture, and he had compassion for them, even fellowshipping with them. He expressed empathy for the people who had been suffering under physical ailments, and he healed them. Jesus warns the disciples of the pain that he feels as he is being hated by the world, and foreshadows the hate that the disciples would experience for carrying out that same mission. He wept as he grieved the loss of a friend, and even more so as he anticipated leaving his closest companions as the day of his crucifixion approached. Jesus experienced emotions. He was tempted. He grieved loss. He felt angst about what was to come. Jesus felt deeply. Put another way, Jesus was deeply human. And part of me wonders if Jesus' statement, "It is finished," on the cross reflects this. After leaving heaven, descending down into the corrupt world, the world that he himself had made and intended for good. After walking in the dust of Roman occupation, frustrated by the failures of Israel's leaders and the idolatry of its people, heartbroken by seeing firsthand the realities of sin and selfishness through disease, conflict, and hatred, all while knowing full well the reason he came into this world was to redeem it and to save his people from these things. Part of me wonders if Jesus' statement, "It is finished," on the cross reflects his anticipation of returning to the Father, returning to the place of glory as the kingdom of God would begin to usher into the broken world he was tired of walking.